This online lecture provides you with a few examples of artwork that was produced during Egypt's New Kingdom period. This was the final period of art production in the history of Egypt, and it is the most fantastic as well. Part of this has to do with what's going on with Egypt at the time. This is the time when Egypt was at its height, and it was not only a political height, but also when it was most wealthy and its realm was most extensive. Now, what is attributed to this is the development of new weapons and new war techniques, which at the very beginning of the New Kingdom period ensured that Egypt was able to remove any foreign occupation that the Egyptians themselves ruled over the territory, and after that expulsion they took on an imperialist agenda and began to go out to take over surrounding territories to expand Egypt's size as an empire. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is when these territories expand, the power isn't only coming from a larger size of the empire, the taking over of all of that region's valuables, but it also extends the access to trade routes as well, which also can function to increase wealth. Now, one thing that we see in art history, particularly ancient art history, is that when we're looking at civilizations that are wealthy, we see that the art is particularly fantastic, and this is because they have expendable income that they can invest into art production. Now, we start out with one of the greatest examples of architecture from the New Kingdom period, and this is the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut. Now, this also is the structure that represents the final phase in the evolution of the Egyptian burial structure, which this evolution was addressed in the previous lecture that you either attended or watched. So we went from the mastaba to the stepped pyramid to the smooth sloped or geometric pyramid to the rock cut tomb, and then finally to the mortuary temple. Now, the prior form of burial is the rock cut tomb, and they still use the rock cut tomb during the New Kingdom period, but we have a little bit of an extra thing going on here. So the rock cut tomb kind of created a problem because these were really discreet, hidden away tombs. And we know that previous tombs, pyramid form, were very great at proclaiming power and wealth, and that was because they were so large in size. You can't forget about these powerful pharaohs because you see their pyramids. So with the rock-cut tomb, it was so discreet that pharaohs began to get worried that people would forget about them and forget about how powerful and wealthy they were because they didn't have a large tomb. The mortuary temple solves this problem. What happens is the temple is built in the lifetime of the pharaoh. The pharaoh uses that temple during their lifetime for their own personal religious worship, and then after the pharaoh passes away, the temple acts as a mortuary temple, testament to the memory and, of course, the power and the wealth of the pharaoh. So problem solved. Here we have this structure that's big and grand and audacious, claiming power, so that the pharaoh's not forgotten, but then the pharaoh still remains buried not in this location, but in that discreet rock-cut tomb. So they're protected, but still remembered. Many people say, I totally agree, that the Temple of Hatshepsut is the best example of mortuary temples built during the New Kingdom period. We can see with the people on the slide a sense of scale. This is a large structure, terrace structure of 3 levels, colonnaded, columns along the front. And it looks very barren here, but when it was actually in use back in the New Kingdom period, it was filled with gardens and plants and things like that. So kind of like this lush oasis within the barren desert. Now, in terms of imagery, the imagery that is associated with this mortuary temple is probably what's a little bit more important for us to be talking about. And the imagery is important once we get an idea of who Hatshepsut was. And she was the first true pharaoh of Egypt. There was one other person who was very short-lived as a pharaoh, not quite as extensive in her political influence that came before, but Hatshepsut was the true first female pharaoh of Egypt, ruling for something like 22 years. Now, this was unorthodox, okay? This is during the 18th dynasty, so we have all these dynasties that came before were not seeing female power, except for the other exception that I briefly mentioned. So this is not at all the norm. And in fact, we don't really see this except for two other more people after Hatshepsut in the 31 dynasties that comprise up of Egyptian history. So what she had to do is she kind of had to justify this to people, to kind of explain why she should be accepted as the pharaoh, as a female pharaoh, especially in the sense that there was a legitimate male heir. She was brilliant, as a political mastermind, and she was able to negotiate her way up to basically become the pharaoh when she was at first simply the regent for a pharaoh waiting to come of age. So how then does Hatshepsut convey this idea that she should be the legitimate pharaoh, that people should accept that? And it comes through her imagery, which we're going to look at quite a bit of. Now, there's relief sculptures on the wall, and some of them are depicting her divine birth to not only attest to her family lineage, okay, the Amos side, to not only connect her with her Amos relatives, which that was legitimate, royal lineage, but also to make her appear as though she's semi-divine. And we've seen this all the time in this, this class, this idea that to convey a sense of power, to legitimize power, that one just simply needs to link themselves with the gods, which she's doing. So, of course, she should be a pharaoh of Egypt. She's divine. She's semi-divine. She's of divine birth. There's also images that show her coronation, that she's being crowned, that she didn't steal the crown, but that it was willingly given to her. She did receive the crown, and that's true. She did maneuver her way into to being pharaoh, but it was something that she didn't have to force. It wasn't like a coup or anything like that. So this is really noteworthy because this really is the first time in the history of art that we have representations of women's achievements that are being depicted. Now let's look at some sculpture in the round. So here's a couple of examples. And I chose these two specifically from the fact that this one comes from the beginning of her reign, and this one is coming a little bit on later in from her reign. Now, in the earlier images of Hatshepsut, you can see that she clearly appears to be a woman. We see more of a feminine treatment of the form, which typically in Egyptian art is these kind of soft, rounded curves. The form is a little bit fleshy. We see clear indication of breasts. And we see this more kind of soft, rounded treatment of the face, which is typically feminine. She does wear the Nemes headdress, which lets us know that she is at this point a pharaoh. Now what's interesting is as time passes, Hatshepsut's image becomes increasingly masculinized, which is what we're starting to see here. Now, if you didn't know that Hatshepsut was a woman, I'm willing to bet that you would think that you were looking in the image of a man rather than a woman. This is very ambiguous, this image, in terms of gender. She is shown kneeling, giving offerings to the gods. Now, this is an indication that she's a pharaoh because pharaohs were really the only people that were permitted to perform this action. We also can see that she's pharaoh with the Nemes headdress. And also you can see that it's broken off. She wears the false beard, right? Which is not only a symbol of kingship, but it's a symbol of masculine kingship, something manly, right? Women don't typically have beards. And so you can also see the form is muscular, and this is a little bit more similar to the type of images of pharaohs that we saw in the Old Kingdom period, these pharaohs that were stiff and trim and muscular. The suggestion of breasts has been replaced for these nicely toned pectoral muscles. Now let's look at, we saw this one, so I'm going to skip that. Let's look at this example here. At Hatshepsut's temple, we also see, and this is important, images of Hatshepsut in the guise of a sphinx, right? We saw a sphinx last class, or last lecture. Half man, half lion. These were, sphinx were typically attributed to kings. We saw in the Old Kingdom period that the Great Sphinx was likely in the image of Khafra. So she kind of follows along with that tradition, shows herself as a sphinx. The same ideas that we saw with the Palette of Narmer in the early dynastic period, that we saw with the Great Sphinx in the Old Kingdom period, that the pharaoh has this responsibility for protection. And we could even argue that this is kind of a masculine thing, that, lions are fierce and they're strong, and these are attributes that are more typically masculine. Now here, this is another type of image that we see of Hatshepsut at her mortuary temple, Hatshepsut as the god Osiris. And this is where I see her image fully becomes masculinized. She looks like a straight up man in this picture. This is not as ambiguous as the kneeling with offering jars that we saw in the previous slide. Now, she is in the guise of a man, Osiris, and she holds the crook and the flail, which are images associated with Osiris. They're also associated with kingship. We see a lot of times kings, holding these as well. You can see here she's wearing kind of a combo crown. We see the bowling pin, right, the head jet that came from Upper Egypt. And so she's wearing this kind of combo crown to show, and also the deshret. Right? The only thing that's missing is that little curly Q, which is supposed to be a representation of a snake coming out of a basket, fierce, protecting Egypt. So she's got the combo crown on to show that she's ruling over Upper and Lower Egypt, which we know is very, very common royal symbolism used by masculine male kings, right? So she's appropriating this masculine imagery. Now, what's interesting, though, is the traces of paint that we see here. When these were initially painted, they were painted kind of like a light creamy color. And this was a color that was typically considered to be a color representing female gender, where dark skin, this kind of reddish color here, this would be masculine. And the idea being is that women, they're constrained to the domestic realm, they stay indoors, they're not out in the public sphere, therefore their skin doesn't get tanned by the sun. So at first, these sculptures had this creamy complexion that was meant to suggest a female gender. Then Hatshepsut had these sculptures painted for this kind of color. It was a weird color, sort of in the middle of the color that you see here, which really confused people because that wasn't a conventional color used to depict gender. So she kind of was in this place of no gender. And then finally she had the sculptures painted one more time, and this is when it truly becomes fully masculinized, where the sculpture features this darker masculine skin color. So she becomes really truly a man at this point. All right, now with all of the money and the wealth that we see in the New Kingdom period, what we start to see is structures that are built that are larger and larger and larger than ever before. The Temple Complex of Luxor is really interesting because this really was a site of focus for a lot of Egyptian pharaohs. And as a testament to their power, what they began to do was they began to sort of build onto this more and more. So the next pharaoh would come in and they would add something to the point now where you have this huge sort of rambling complex that consists of multiple structures. And you can kind of see some cars here to give you a sense of scale. This was very, very large in size. Now, this complex contains structures that are typical of later Egyptian temples. We have our façade. It looks like facade, but it's French, so it's pronounced façade, which is the front face of this structure here. And very typically, the front face would have very large scale relief sculptures of the pharaoh doing things like smiting captives or being masculine and powerful in some sort of way. Now, the facade sits on the face of these two kind of like pyramid structures, which are called pylon. This is very, very typical of Egyptian architecture, where the front of the structure is faced by these pylon walls, which are meant to just kind of provide this very clear but very almost intimidating entry point. Now, we can see that behind there we have a series of pillared halls, which are called hypostyle halls, halls that are filled with pillars. And these structures tended to be very dark. They appeared to be very mysterious, but along the top, which unfortunately we can't see in the remains of this structure, along the top of the columns you had what were called the clerestory, which were windows that allowed in light. The windows spanned along the edges of the hypostyle hall. This is important, the clerestory. This is actually going to play in quite a bit to early Christian architecture. I want to bring in the clerestory here to mention, just so that we know that when we get to early Christian architecture, it's not something that the early Christians invent, that they're actually utilizing an architectural form that has its origins all the way back into ancient Egypt. Now, beyond this, okay, we have a symmetrical arrangement of structures, so it's not just like randomly placing things. Everything's very careful, very just so, and they are arranged in a way to where they kind of shield from the entry point the holiest of holies, so to speak, which was the temple that was set aside for the god Amun, who at this point, after a shifting of hierarchy in the Egyptian pantheon, became the most important of the Egyptian gods, the god of life. Now, this was regarded as the actual house of the god, which is why this was the holiest of holies. It was very sacred, so not just anybody could go in. And in fact, kind of like the mortuary temple at the stepped pyramid of Zoser, this too was also a structure based on exclusion. It didn't look like this at its time of use, where you could just kind of walk in. It was surrounded by walls. Now, normal people, ordinary people like you and me, we wouldn't be permitted to enter into this temple. But pretend we were like kind of rich, or up there in the class system, we would maybe be permitted to come into this front area. It was only in these back areas that higher ranking priests and the pharaoh were allowed to visit, and then back in the back, the holiest of holies, it was very, very restricted access. The sheer size of this complex, of course, is a way to show how powerful Egypt had become, and how wealthy as well, to have the kind of resources to continually build up these types of structures. Now, we're in the New Kingdom period, but we move on to a very specific period within this period, which is the Amarna period. It is a short-lived period, but it is a time of really, really significant change within Egypt. And this is political change, but more specifically, it is religious change, and it is also art historical change. Now, one of the things that happened, okay, was Hatshepsut. She really needed the support of the priests as a way to legitimize her reign as a female pharaoh, especially when there was a male legitimate era that she kind of usurped. So she gave a lot to the priests, a lot of money and resources in exchange for their favor. What happened was the priests began to get more and more powerful, to the point that when we get to the Amarna period, the pharaoh at the time, Amenhotep IV, started to get very concerned about the priestly power. And so he did something that I personally think is brilliant. What he did is he told the Egyptians, hey guys, I know that we have always, through the entire history of our civilization, been polytheistic, worshiping multiple gods. Actually, we are now monotheistic. We worship only one god. That god is Aten. And by the way, the only people that can really interact with Aten is me and my family. Brilliant political move, because what he did is he basically made the priest class obsolete. They didn't have any sort of power. They were not intermediaries between the people and the gods. And it also created for Akhenaten at this time, Amenhotep IV, he changes his name to Akhenaten. It creates for Amenhotep IV this idea that he's kind of like a priest king in a way, that he is the head political leader. He now becomes the head religious leader as well. Now, he has to kind of justify this to people. I mean, how is it that you get to be the only guy with, that's interacting with the one true God? And what he does is he explains, well, me and my family were special. And he uses art to show they're special. They're special because they don't look like us. Now, this creates a type of sculptural style that had never been seen before in Egyptian art. We know that it was quite standard. The pharaoh is stiff, and he is muscular, and he is trim. And Akhenaten completely changes that, creates the Amarna style. Now, the bust of Nefertiti that we see here, this is actually not the best example of this style, but I bring it in because it's so familiar, so that at least you can see this image in the future and you can know the context of it, that it's from the Amarna period. Now, we do see a little bit of manipulation of form. We do have a neck that's a little bit long and slender, and the slenderness of the neck is really emphasized by the heaviness of the headdress. Now, the thing about this is that we also have some idealization here, showing her as perfect in the case of being beautiful. It's almost kind of like a generic beauty. And the idea is that Nefertiti is not only like beautiful physically, but it's a spiritual beauty as well. Now let's move on. This is a better comparison. This better gives you an idea of how the Amarna style really changes in terms of the depiction of the pharaoh. Here's this image of Khafra. We've seen this in our Old Kingdom Period lecture. Very typical in that it is an image of this man who is stiff and who is trim and who is muscular. Now, what happens is first of all, this is called Akhenaten. Amenhotep IV changes his name. He changes his name to Akhenaten so that he incorporates into his name the one true God as a way to better affiliate himself. Then he begins to create these images of himself. Now, not only is he not trim and muscular, he's actually feminine in appearance, which really is something that we had not seen in Egypt prior, this idea of men appearing to be more feminine. Now, the idea behind this is what some people suggest, is that he makes it so that his body has both masculine and feminine attributes as also a testament to the one God. Because in the past, there was all these different gods. They came together, the masculine and feminine principles, to create. But now creation only comes from one source, masculine, feminine, and one, just like we see masculine and feminine in one here. We see that he is not trim, but he actually has a belly. He's not stiff. There's a lot of curve that we see throughout. The form sort of undulates, a lot of curving. There's a lot of elongation. We see it in the torso. We see it in this super long false beard, which has been broken off, so one can only imagine how long this actually was. Elongation of the face. Here's some kind of weird elongated ears. Let's look at another example. This is a great example of the Amarna sculptural approach. Akhenaten and his family, this is Nefertiti, who was his great wife, and it's a really unique image, political image, because it's an image of the pharaoh and his family. We don't usually see images of the pharaoh and the family. Not only is it an image of the pharaoh and the family, but it is one that has a level of intimacy where they sit together, they interact lovingly with their children, who I personally think look like baby aliens. Now you can see the Amarna style here. You can see the elongation of form. You see it in the neck. You see it in this super long torso here. You see the sort of fleshy body with the belly that hangs over. You see the more feminine treatment and form. And in fact, if you compare Akhenaten's form to Nefertiti's, they look very similar. They look very similar. And in fact, a lot of art that comes from the Amarna period, it's very difficult to even tell the difference visually between Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Now you can also see kind of a manipulation of form with these heads, right? And again, this is all typical of the Amarna style. They sit underneath here. This is a symbol of the one god Aten. This is important because in the past, Egyptian gods took the form of man or hybrid figures. Now the god Aten is taking form of an abstract symbol, shining his rays down, giving favor to the royal family. Now, a lot of people kind of ask why, especially with these weird heads. You know, what's with the weird heads? What's with the weird shape? And some people say, well, Akhenaten suffered from a disease, okay, Marfan syndrome, which has these effects of misshaping the body to make it look feminine. The appendages are elongated, and the head becomes misshapen. And also along the line of disease, some people say that these babies, little babies, the princesses, as well as even maybe Akhenaten, could have suffered from encephalitis, which is something that causes the fluids in the brain to make the head, they swell, and it makes the head misshapen. Now this is mummy KV35, which is believed to be Akhenaten. We do see some misshapen skull, but not to the extent of what we see here. So this may be an explanation, but perhaps not. The other thing is Egyptians were crazy inbreeders, and so a lot of these kind of physical deformities and these diseases could come from the fact that they were, breeding in very close quarters, so to speak, in terms of familial relationships. I think when it really comes down to it, this is part of the sculptural style. Creating these weird proportions as a way to show that these people are different, they're not like us, and therefore it legitimizes their right and their responsibility to communicate solely with this one god, Aten.